Ethan Brooks stood frozen in a stranger's living room, staring at something he was never supposed to see. His toolbox hit the floor. She didn't scream, she didn't cover herself. She just turned around, met his eyes, and smiled like she'd been expecting him. "Well, now you have to take responsibility." 5 words. And Ethan's entire carefully built world cracked right down the middle. But here's what nobody knew. Not even Ethan. The door wasn't accidentally open. The zipper wasn't accidentally stuck. And she hadn't accidentally moved in next door. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. Ethan Brooks hadn't cried at his own divorce. That was the part that scared him most. Not the papers, not the empty half of the closet, not even the night Rachel packed her last box and drove away without looking back. What scared him was standing in the kitchen the morning after making 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then quietly pouring one down the drain, and feeling absolutely nothing. Just numb. Like a circuit breaker that tripped during a storm and never reset. He was 44 years old. He owned a small boat repair shop on the edge of Lake Carver in upstate New York, a town so quiet that the loudest thing most mornings was the sound of Canada geese arguing over dock space. He had a 7-year-old son named Noah, who collected rocks and talked to the family's arthritic old beagle Biscuit, like the dog understood every word. And he had a house, a good house, 2 stories wrap-around porch, the kind of house that real estate listings called full of character, because they couldn't say full of silence. Ethan called it home. Most days that was enough. He wasn't unhappy. He'd made peace with that distinction a long time ago. Unhappy meant you were still fighting something. Ethan wasn't fighting. He was just maintaining, keeping things running, replacing what was broken, patching what could still be saved, and leaving the rest alone. Same as he did with boats. It was a Tuesday in late September when his neighbor's house finally sold. He'd watched it sit empty for almost 8 months, that pale blue colonial on the left side of his property, separated by a split-rail fence and an old sugar maple that dropped leaves into both yards every fall. He'd mowed the grass twice during that stretch out of sheer principle, because an untended lawn offended something deep in his nature. He'd fixed the loose board on the front porch steps without being asked, because it would have eventually become a hazard, and nobody else was going to do it. That was Ethan. He fixed things. Not because he needed the thanks. Just because things that were broken bothered him. The moving truck came on a Saturday. He saw it from his workshop window. A medium-sized rental, not enormous, nothing pretentious. 1 person directing the movers. A woman. Dark hair pulled up under a baseball cap, sleeves rolled to her elbows, pointing and gesturing with the authority of someone who had done this before and wasn't going to spend the day watching other people do it wrong. He didn't go introduce himself. Not because he was rude. Because Noah was at his mother's for the weekend and the shop had 3 boats backed up, and Ethan had learned years ago that introductions led to conversations. Conversations led to obligations, and obligations led to the kind of slow entanglement that left you sitting in a lawyer's office, signing papers you never imagined you'd sign. He went back to sanding the hull of a 1968 Chris Craft. He thought nothing more about it. 记表. 2 weeks later, he borrowed a pipe wrench from his own garage and couldn't find it. He had a clear memory, vivid specific, of lending it to Tom Garrett from down the road, about 3 weeks before the neighbor moved in. Tom had needed it for a water heater repair, said he'd bring it back by Sunday. Typical Tom. The wrench was sitting in Tom's garage, probably under a pile of extension cords, and that was that. But then Ethan needed it. A customer's boat had a compression fitting that wouldn't budge, and his second wrench was the wrong size, and driving to the hardware store felt like conceding defeat. He called Tom. Tom said he'd returned the toolbox, not just the wrench, the entire red metal toolbox Ethan had apparently lent him along with it, which Ethan had no memory of doing 2 days ago. Left it on Ethan's porch because he wasn't home. Ethan checked the porch. Nothing. He checked the garage. Nothing. He walked around the side of the house, checked the back porch, the workshop entryway, the bed of his truck. Nothing. He stood in the driveway and tried to reconstruct it rationally. Tom had come by 2 days ago. Ethan had been at Noah's school pickup. Tom left it on the porch. Someone had moved it, but who Noah hadn't been home. Biscuit certainly hadn't. And then he saw it. Sitting on the front steps of the pale blue Colonial next door, his red metal toolbox. His neighbor must have grabbed it, thinking it had been left for her by mistake. The porches were close. It was a reasonable error. He'd just go over, knock, explain, pick it up, and be back in the shop in 4 minutes. Simple. Easy. Done. He crossed the yard, stepped through the gap in the split-rail fence, and walked up the porch steps. The front door was pulled to not latched, just resting against the frame, with maybe an inch of space where it hadn't fully caught. He could see the toolbox clearly on the top step. He picked it up. He was already turning to leave when he heard her voice from inside. Not words, more like a frustrated exhale, a short, sharp sound of aggravation. Then, "Oh, come on." He paused. It was involuntary. A reflex. The same reflex that made him stop when he heard an engine knocking wrong or a hull creaking under the wrong kind of pressure. "Come on, come on, come on." Something in her voice told him she wasn't in distress, just annoyed, stuck maybe. He should have kept walking. He knew that then, and he knows it now. Instead, he made a decision he would think about for a long time. Afterward, he reached up and knocked on the door frame. The door swung open 4 inches, and that was all it took. Through the gap across 12 feet of hardwood floor, in what must have been the living room, she was standing with her back to the door. One arm twisted behind her fingers, working at something between her shoulder blades. She was wearing a dress, a dark green dress, half on half off the zipper, stuck somewhere in the middle of her back. Her other hand braced against the wall. Her hair was loose now, falling forward over her shoulder. Ethan's brain transmitted a clear, immediate instruction. Look away, knock harder, say something, announce yourself. He did none of these things. He stood there for what could not have been more than 3 seconds, though it felt geological, like tectonic plates shifting, and then the woman stopped fighting the zipper. She went completely still. And then she turned around. Not frantically, not with the sharp, sudden movement of someone caught off guard. She turned slowly, like someone who had heard a sound and wanted to identify its source before reacting. She looked at him through the 4-inch gap. He looked at her. Her expression wasn't shock. It wasn't anger. It was something he struggled to categorize in the moment and would struggle with for days afterward. She held his gaze for 1 second, 2, 3, and then slowly, without breaking eye contact, she smiled. Not a laugh. Not an embarrassed grin, a real smile. Calm and deliberate, like the punchline to a joke she'd been sitting on for a while. She said clearly and without hesitation, "Well, now you have to take responsibility." Ethan Brooks, a man who had once talked a panicking customer through a hull breach in 4-foot swells without raising his voice, a man who had sat across from a divorce attorney for 2 hours, without flinching, opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She tilted her head slightly, still smiling, still completely composed. "I'm guessing you're the neighbor," she said. He cleared his throat. Yes. Ethan Brooks. I came to get my toolbox. It was on I think there was a mix-up." "I grabbed it off the wrong porch," she said. "Sorry about that. I thought Tom left it for me." "Tom Garrett." "My cousin," she said. "He's been helping me get settled. I should have checked the name on the latch." She glanced at the box in his hand. "Is everything in there?" I haven't checked." "Then maybe don't leave yet." She turned back to the wall, reached for the zipper again, and struggled with it for exactly 2 seconds before exhaling through her nose. "Could you—" She glanced back over her shoulder. I've been fighting this thing for 10 minutes. The track is bent. Every rational instinct Ethan had said, say no. Put the toolbox down. Walk home. What he said was, yeah, okay. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, set the toolbox on the floor. He crossed the room. She held her hair forward with one hand, presenting the stuck zipper with the professional patience of someone submitting a repair job. He looked at it. The track had a small crimp visible when you knew what to look for. He got 2 fingers around the pull, pinched the fabric below with his other hand to create slack and moved it slowly, not forcing it, feeling for the catch point. It released. The zipper slid clean to the top in one motion. She let her hair fall back. Thank you. The track's bent, he said, stepping back. You'll need to replace the whole zipper if you want it to run right long term. Probably a seamstress can do it in 20 minutes. She turned to face him fully, now the dress intact, expression unchanged. Are you always this thorough about things that aren't your problem? When I can see exactly what's wrong, he said. Yes. She extended her hand. Claire Maddox. Ethan Brooks. He shook it, firm, quick, professional. I know, she said. He paused. We've never met. Tom mentioned you. She said it easily, without elaboration, and moved toward the kitchen. Can I get you something coffee water? It's the least I can do after involving you in a wardrobe emergency. I'm fine. I need to get back to the shop. The boat repair place by the lake. That's right. What are you working on? And he stopped. Nobody asked him that. Not seriously. Not expecting an actual answer. A 68 Chris-Craft Constellation, he said. Hull restoration. Previous owner used the wrong primer under the waterline, so I'm cutting it back to bare wood and starting over. She leaned against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, head tilted in a way that suggested she was genuinely processing the information. How long does that take? Weeks, if I do it right. And if you don't do it right, the hull fails in 2 seasons and the owner blames the lake. She smiled again, different from the first one, smaller, more inward, like she'd confirmed something she'd suspected. I won't keep you, she said, but I'm having dinner Thursday. My cousin Tom and a couple people from town. Nothing formal, just food and noise. You're welcome to come. I have my son that week. Bring him. He picked up the toolbox. I'll think about it. You won't come, she said pleasantly. Dad. He stopped at the door. Excuse me? You won't come, she repeated, still smiling. But that's okay. The offer stands whenever you change your mind. He looked at her for a moment. You just moved in, he said. You don't know me. No, she agreed. But Tom talks. He walked home. He didn't go to Thursday dinner. She was right about that. But he did find himself on Friday morning replacing the broken board on her back fence that he'd noticed while putting out his trash, because it was a safety hazard, he told himself, and he had spare lumber, and it took 15 minutes. He did not knock on her door to tell her. He just fixed it, packed up, and went back to work. That afternoon, a cup of coffee appeared on the workbench inside his open workshop. Still hot, dark roast, in a plain white travel cup with no note. He looked out the open bay door toward the fence line. Nobody there. He drank it. It went like that for the first few weeks. Not conversations exactly, more like parallel movement. 2 people orbiting the same small geography without quite intersecting. She jogged past his workshop in the mornings. He left her driveway clear of leaves on the days he raked. She brought coffee, never made a production of it, never waited around for thanks, just left it and disappeared. He fixed things, the fence, then a dripping outdoor spigot he could hear from his yard, then the porch light that had been flickering on the wrong schedule. Neither of them mentioned it. Noah, however, had no such restraint. The first time Noah met Claire was a Sunday afternoon. Ethan was in the driveway doing an oil change on his truck, and Noah was crouched near the garden with a stick trying to coax a garter snake out from under a rock, when Claire came through the gap in the fence, carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Hi," she said to the boy crouching in the dirt. Noah looked up. "Hi. Are you the new person?" "I am. I'm Claire." "I'm Noah. What's on the plate?" "Lemon poppy seed muffins. I made too many." Noah stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and looked at her with absolute seriousness. "Are they good?" "I think so, but I'm biased." "What does biased mean?" "It means I made them, so I can't really be objective." Noah considered this. "My dad made pancakes once that were really bad, and he thought they were fine," he said. "So I think you're right about being biased." Ethan stood up from the truck, wiping his hands on a rag. "Noah." "What, it's true." Claire laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, and it changed her whole face. She handed the plate to Noah, who immediately peeled back a corner of the foil and bit directly into a muffin without ceremony. "They're good," he announced through a mouthful. "Thank you," she said. Completely unbiased opinion received. She looked at Ethan. He nodded at her. She nodded back. "I'll leave you to it," she said. She went back through the fence. Noah turned to his father with the muffin plate tucked under one arm like a football. "She's nice," he said. Ethan went back to the oil change. "She seems okay." "She looked at you like Mrs. Patterson looks at Mr. Patterson." "Get that muffin away from the dog." "Biscuit won't eat it." "Biscuit will eat anything. Put it on the porch." Noah went to the porch. From behind the truck, Ethan heard him say to no one in particular, or possibly to Biscuit, "Dad never notices anything." Ethan tightened the drain plug and said nothing. He noticed everything. That was the problem. What he noticed specifically was this: she never pushed. Every woman he'd known who was interested in a man pushed not badly, not cruelly, just the way people do when they want something. Small escalations, testing, closing distance. But Claire didn't do that. She maintained exactly the amount of space he set, never crossing into territory he hadn't opened first, never pressing on the places that were still sore. It was disarming in a way he couldn't quite explain. It was also, and he would not have admitted this to anyone, not even to himself, clearly exactly what he would have needed if he'd been able to articulate what he needed. Which he couldn't. That was kind of the whole issue. October came hard that year. 3 nights of frost before the middle of the month, and the maple between their yards dropped everything at once in a single overnight. Ethan came out at 6 in the morning to a carpet of yellow leaves from property line to property line. He started raking. 20 minutes later, Claire came out of her back door with a second rake and started on her side without a word. They worked toward the middle. At some point their rows converged, and they were standing 6 feet apart, raking toward the same pile, and neither of them had spoken. Then she said, "I have a question, and I want an honest answer." "Okay." "Why haven't you asked me anything about myself?" He kept raking. "What do you mean?" "We've been neighbors for 6 weeks. We've talked. We've had coffee. Your son interrogated me for 40 minutes last Tuesday about whether snakes feel cold. And you have never once asked me where I came from, what I do, why I moved here." He thought about it. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people would find that rude," she said. "Most people would have answered before I asked." Another pause. "Fair point," she said. They finished the pile. Ethan got the tarp. They bagged the leaves together in a rhythm that didn't require coordination, because it just worked 2 people moving around the same task without getting in each other's way. When they were done, she leaned on her rake and looked at him. "Do you want to know?" "If you want to tell me. I'm a furniture designer. I was in Brooklyn for 11 years. I got out of a long relationship in the spring, decided I needed water and quiet, and Tom mentioned the house. She paused. That's the short version. Is there a long version? She smiled. There's always a long version. Then I'll ask eventually, he said. He picked up the tarp and folded it. Thank you for the help. Thank you for not asking why I did it. He stopped. Why did you? Exactly, she said, and went inside. That night after Noah was asleep and Biscuit was snoring on the couch, he wasn't technically allowed on. Ethan sat on the porch in the dark with a cup of coffee, he barely touched, and looked at the light in the window of the pale blue house next door. He sat there for a long time. Not thinking exactly. Just aware of some low-frequency hum in the back of his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't name it. He finished his coffee, went inside, and locked the door. But the hum didn't go away. In the weeks that followed, something shifted slowly, quietly, the way the best and most dangerous things always do. And Ethan Brooks, a man who had spent years fixing everything around him, was about to discover something he had overlooked entirely. His own heart wasn't as repaired as he thought. The coffee was already on his workbench when he got to the shop at 7:15 the next morning. Same white travel cup, still hot, dark roast. Ethan stood in the doorway of his workshop for a moment looking at it. Then he looked toward the fence line. Nothing. Just the yard, the maple, the pale blue house with its curtains drawn. He picked up the cup and drank. He didn't say anything about it. Not that day, not the next. But something in him had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way ice cracks in late February, before you can see it happening on the surface. He went about his work the way he always did. He sanded, he sealed, he fitted and measured and replaced what was beyond saving. But somewhere underneath all of that routine, something was listening for footsteps on the gravel, or the sound of a door opening next door, or the particular pitch of a laugh that he'd only heard once and couldn't quite stop hearing. He didn't examine it too closely. That was the Ethan Brooks method. If you looked at a structural problem too directly, sometimes you talked yourself into believing it wasn't there. So he worked. And he waited for something he wouldn't admit he was waiting for. It came on a Wednesday. He was under the hull of the Chris Craft, lying on his back on the rolling creeper, when he heard Noah's voice out in the yard, and that shouldn't have happened because Noah was supposed to be at school until 3:15. He rolled out from under the boat, grabbed a rag for his hands, and came to the workshop door. Noah was standing at the fence. Claire was on her side, and they were deep in conversation about something that clearly mattered very much to at least one of them. But if you hold it here, Noah was saying, pointing at something in his palm that Ethan couldn't see from the doorway, it can smell you, and then it knows you're safe. Is that how it works with all snakes, or just garter snakes? Claire asked. She was crouching down to his level, which not every adult thought to do. I think all snakes, but I've only really tested it with garter snakes because the other ones are harder to catch. That's a solid scientific method, she said. Test what you can actually get your hands on. Noah beamed. That's what I told my teacher, and she said that was a good point, but maybe don't bring snakes to school to test. Ethan stepped out. Why are you home? Noah turned around. Half day. You forgot. I didn't forget. You forgot, Claire said, standing up, and there was nothing unkind about how she said it. Just easy matter of fact, the verbal equivalent of a hand briefly on the shoulder. Ethan looked at his son. Did you take the bus? Tom picked me up, Noah said. He was at Claire's and said he'd grab me since you forgot. Tom Garrett. Of course. Ethan had met Claire's cousin twice by then, a broad-shouldered, cheerful man in his late 40s who fixed boats himself on weekends and apparently had no concept of personal boundaries when it came to small-town social engineering. He could already feel the shape of what had happened here, and it wasn't entirely accidental. Tom still here? Ethan asked. He left, Claire said. He had to get back to the marina, but I told him I'd watch Noah until you were free. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't have to. Noah looked back and forth between them with the naked, evaluative curiosity of a 7-year-old who is picking up on something adults think they're hiding. Can I have a muffin? He asked Claire. There's banana bread today, actually. Even better. Noah, Ethan said. What, I'm hungry, and it's a half day. Claire opened the gate in the fence. Come on, she said. You can help me figure out if the second loaf is done. Noah went through the gate like he owned the property. Claire held it open and looked at Ethan with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and a quiet, patient question. You want to come in? She said. I'll make more coffee. Real coffee, not just a drive-by drop. And he looked at the workshop. He looked at his son already disappearing through her back door. He looked at the travel cup still sitting on his workbench. 20 minutes, he said. That's fine, she said. Although Noah will want at least 40. She was right about that too. And he sat at her kitchen table, big wooden covered in design sketches and material swatches that she pushed to one side without ceremony, and drank the best cup of coffee he'd had in probably 2 years. She made it in a French press, which he hadn't used since before the marriage, and she made it correctly, meaning she actually timed the steep instead of guessing. He noted this without comment. Noah ate 2 pieces of banana bread and told Claire about his rock collection with the focused intensity of someone delivering a congressional briefing. Claire listened with an attention that was either genuine or the most convincing performance Ethan had ever seen. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details from one sentence and referenced them 3 sentences later. At one point, she asked Noah what his favorite rock was and why, and Noah said without hesitation, a piece of granite from the creek behind our house because it has pink feldspar in it, and Dad told me what feldspar was, and then I looked it up and he was right, which doesn't always happen. Hey, Ethan said. With science stuff, Noah clarified generously. Claire's mouth twitched. She looked at Ethan over the rim of her mug. He looked back. That was the first time he felt it clearly, not the hum this time, but something sharper. A recognition. Like turning a corner in a city you've been to once before and realizing you know exactly where you are. He left after 45 minutes, not 20. He told himself it was because of Noah. That night, after Noah was in bed and Biscuit was doing his illegal couch occupation, Ethan sat at his own kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and tried to work through an estimate for a new client's transom repair. He'd done 100 of these estimates. He could do them without thinking. But he sat there for 20 minutes and couldn't get the numbers to cooperate because some part of his brain was still in Claire's kitchen, sitting at that table, watching her ask his son about granite, like it was the most important thing she'd heard all week. Why? He put down the pen. He went to bed. He did not sleep well. 3 days later, she knocked on his workshop door in the middle of the afternoon with 2 sandwiches wrapped in butcher paper and a question he wasn't expecting. Do you ever take the boats out yourself? She asked, setting the sandwiches on his spare workbench like she'd been doing it for years. Sometimes, he said. Why? I've been on a lake exactly once in the last decade. I'd like to go again. He looked at her. You want to go out on the lake? I'm asking if you ever do. It's not the same thing. She tilted her head. Although I wouldn't say no if that's what you're offering. I wasn't offering. I know. She sat down on the stool he kept near the hull and unwrapped her sandwich without apparent concern. Tom says you used to take Noah out every Sunday morning before everything got complicated. Ethan picked up his own sandwich. Tom talks a lot. He does, she agreed. It's one of his worst qualities, and also how I know everyone in town already. What else did he tell you? That you refinished the dock at the Henderson's house for free when Walter Henderson had his stroke because Linda couldn't afford to hire anyone, and you didn't want her to have to ask. She said it simply, no editorial weight on it. He told me that before I'd ever met you. Ethan set down his sandwich. That was 3 years ago. I know. Something about the way she said it, the flatness, the precision of it tripped a small wire in the back of his mind. Not enough to pull on yet, just enough to notice. He filed it and let it go. Sunday mornings, he said. Noah's with his mother this weekend, but next Sunday. She smiled. Okay. It's a working boat, he said. Not comfortable. I don't need comfortable. You might get wet. I'll wear something I don't mind ruining. He nodded. The conversation was over, and she seemed to know it because she finished her sandwich, thanked him for the company, which he almost pointed out he hadn't actually provided, but didn't, and left. He looked at the half-eaten sandwich. He picked it back up. He realized he'd been hungry for 3 hours and hadn't noticed until she brought food. He ate the whole thing and got back to work. Sunday came. He was at the dock at 7 in the morning, pulling the canvas off the boat, a solid 1970s-era aluminum runabout that he kept for personal use. Nothing elegant, purely functional when he heard footsteps on the dock behind him and turned to find Claire walking toward him in worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and a pair of boots that looked like they'd actually seen outdoor use. No performance, no preparation for being looked at. He appreciated that more than he would have said out loud. They went out for 2 hours. She didn't talk much, which surprised him. He'd expected questions. She was a question asker, he'd established that much. But out on the water, she seemed to settle into a different mode, quieter, turned toward the lake and the tree line and the gray October light, in a way that suggested she was someone who could be still without being uncomfortable. They sat anchored for a while near the center of the lake. He poured coffee from a thermos. She took a cup and held it in both hands. After a long moment, she said, I grew up near water, Michigan, a smaller lake than this. My dad had a canoe he'd patched so many times, the patches had patches. What happened to it? He died when I was 19. The canoe's still in my mother's garage. Ethan looked at the water. I'm sorry. It's been a while, she said. Not dismissive, just honest. I don't bring it up for sympathy. I bring it up because I think you understand what it means when someone keeps fixing something instead of replacing it. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I do. She looked at him, then direct, unhurried. He looked back. Neither of them said anything else, and it didn't feel like silence. It felt like two people who'd found the same frequency without having to search for it. He started the motor. They went back. He helped her off the boat at the dock, and she didn't need the help. She was steady, capable, clearly comfortable near water despite her claimed inexperience, but she took his hand anyway briefly, and then released it the moment she was on solid ground. Thank you, she said. Anytime, he said. He meant it. He would realize later, turning the word over in his head while sanding down a patch job that evening, that it was the first time in years he'd said any time, and actually wanted it to be true. October turned to November. The cold came in fast and permanent. Noah started spending more time at Claire's in the afternoons. She had a drafting table that fascinated him, and she let him sketch his own rock cataloging system on the extra paper. And Biscuit had apparently decided her back porch was a better napping spot than any surface in Ethan's house. Ethan retrieved his dog from her porch 3 times in 1 week. Each time she had coffee ready. Each time he stayed longer than he planned. He told himself it was logistics. He was a practical man. The coffee was good, the company was easy, and his son was right there. It was Tom Garrett who broke that particular illusion on a Saturday afternoon when he showed up at Ethan's workshop with a 6-pack and sat down on the hull of the Chris Craft without asking. She likes you, Tom said. Give me a hand with this clamp, Ethan said. Tom held the clamp. I'm serious. She doesn't do the coffee thing for just anyone. She brings coffee to be neighborly. Tom looked at him. Ethan, she gets up 45 minutes early to make sure it's hot when you open the shop. I know this because she told me, and she only told me because I asked her directly why she looked tired. and she is not someone who explains herself easily. He paused. She likes you. Ethan tightened the clamp. Tom. I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I'm just telling you so you stop walking around with your eyes closed. I'm not walking around with my eyes closed. Tom picked up his beer, looked at the label, looked at the boat. She moved here in September, he said. You know when she first asked me about the house. The listing's been up for 8 months, around when it went on the market, I assume. Tom shook his head. February. Ethan stopped. February of last year, Tom said. Before it was even officially listed. She called me and asked if I knew anything about property on Lake Carver. Said she'd heard about the area from someone. He shrugged. I thought it was a coincidence at the time. And now? Tom looked at him steadily. Now I think maybe you ought to ask her a few more questions than you've been asking. Ethan stood up. He set down the wrench. He looked at the hull of the boat for a long moment. She's a private person, he finally said. She is, Tom agreed. But she's not secretive about nothing. There's a difference. Tom finished his beer, left the other 5, and went home. Ethan stayed in the shop until 9 o'clock that night. He didn't look in her windows, but he noticed the light was on. It was still on when he finally went inside. He sat at his kitchen table. He pulled out his phone. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there with the phone face down on the table and thought about February. About a house that wasn't listed yet. About a woman who knew which grit sandpaper he preferred without asking who knew the name of the boat he was restoring. Who knew that Noah liked banana bread more than muffins? Because Noah had mentioned it exactly once 3 weeks ago, and she had remembered. He thought about the way she'd said on the first day I know, when he'd told her his name. Tom mentioned you. He'd believed that. He'd had no reason not to. It was a reasonable thing to say. It explained everything cleanly. He was a practical man, and he took the clean explanation when it was available. But something was sitting differently now. Some small stone he couldn't ignore. He went to bed. He lay in the dark, and what kept coming back, not with alarm, not with accusation, just with the steady, insistent persistence of a detail that doesn't quite fit, was the image of a woman crouched next to the fence listening to his 7-year-old son describe his rock collection, asking the right questions at the right moments, not in the way of someone performing interest, but in the way of someone who already knew what mattered to this child. He pressed it down. He found sleep eventually the way you find it when you're tired enough and the night is cold and the house is quiet. But the stone was still there in the morning. He found it sitting in his chest while he made breakfast and carried it all the way down to the shop and set it on the workbench next to the white travel cup, which was already there, still hot. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Then he drank it. Because whatever the answer was, whatever the real story underneath the clean explanation turned out to be, he wasn't sure yet that knowing it was going to change anything, and that more than anything else was what scared him. The sketchbook was an accident, or at least that was what Ethan told himself for the first hour after he found it, that it was an accident, that it didn't mean what it looked like, that there was a clean explanation, the way there was always a clean explanation if you were willing to look for one. It was a Thursday afternoon in mid-November. Claire had asked him to help her move a heavy work table from the back room to the main studio space. She was reconfiguring her workspace, she said, and Tom was unavailable, and the table was solid maple and not something one person could safely move alone. He said yes, the way he'd been saying yes to small things for weeks now, without too much deliberation, because it was practical and she needed the help, and he happened to be available. They moved the table. It took 6 minutes. She was strong for her size and didn't pretend otherwise, which he appreciated. Afterward, she made coffee, which she always did, and Noah, who had materialized from somewhere in the house where he'd been drawing on her spare drafting paper, was at the kitchen table, already deep in conversation with Biscuit about something Biscuit was visibly uninterested in. Ethan waited for the coffee and looked around the studio space, the the way he always looked at rooms, practically structurally, noting what worked and what didn't. The new table position was better. The light would hit the work surface more directly. He could see why she'd wanted it moved. And then he saw the sketchbook on the shelf. It wasn't hidden. That was the thing. It was sitting on a low, open shelf near the drafting table spine, out between two larger binders. Black cover, no label. Not unusual for a designer. He wouldn't have given it a second look except that it was thicker than the others and sat at a slight angle, like it had been pulled out and replaced recently, and the corner of a photograph was sticking out from between the pages near the back. A photograph, not a sketch, not a material sample. A photograph. He didn't touch it. He noticed it, registered it, and looked away. But in that fraction of a second, the way your eyes process detail faster than your conscious mind can catch up, he saw enough. Not clearly, not specifically, just the color palette of the image, the outdoor setting, the particular quality of light that belonged to a certain season and time of day. It looked like his doc. He didn't say anything. He drank his coffee. He watched Noah try to explain to Biscuit why granite was more interesting than quartz, and listened to Claire talk about a commission she'd just taken on a dining table for a family in Vermont, Live Edge Walnut. The client wanted something that looked like it had always existed. He contributed to the conversation. He laughed in the right places. He was present in the way he was always present, fully quietly, without making a production of it. He went home at 5:30. He made Noah's dinner. He helped with homework. He sat on the porch after Noah was asleep and held a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and sat with the image of that photograph, the corner of it, the sliver, and did not immediately draw conclusions, because he was not a man who drew conclusions from incomplete information. But he also couldn't put it down. 3 days passed. He was careful during those 3 days in a way he couldn't entirely explain. Not cold, not distant, just slightly more deliberate. Measuring his steps. He hated that he was doing it. It felt like something Rachel used to accuse him of, that guarded quality, the emotional equivalent of putting everything behind glass. On the 4th day, Claire showed up at the workshop with lunch the way she occasionally did, and set it on the workbench and said, "You've been quiet." "I'm always quiet," he said. "Quieter than quiet," she said. "Which for you is really saying something." He looked up from the hull. She was watching him with that steady, patient attention she turned on everything. The same attention she gave Noah's rock lectures, the same attention she gave her own work. Absolute, unhurried. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." "When Tom told you about the house, the listing, when was that exactly?" "Monday." Something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, not quite. More like the face of someone who has been holding a breath for a very long time and just felt the first real pressure to let it out. She was quiet for a moment. A real moment. Not the performative pause of someone constructing a story, but the genuine stillness of someone deciding how much truth to offer. "Tom didn't tell me about the listing," she said. Ethan set down his sandpaper. "Okay. I found it myself. Why were you looking?" Another pause. She sat down on the stool. She looked at her hands briefly, then back at him, and there it was again, that directness she had, that refusal to let a moment be anything other than what it was. "I knew about Lake Carver before I called Tom," she said carefully. "I'd been following your work, the restoration work. I found an article about you in a regional boating magazine. One of those small circulation things maybe 3 years ago. You'd done a restoration on an antique runabout that won a show, and the article had a photograph of you at the dock here. I kept the article." She stopped, started again. "That's not the whole story, but it's where it started." Ethan didn't move. He stood at the hull with his hands at his sides and looked at her. "You kept an article?" "Yes." "For 3 years?" "Yes." "And then you bought the house next door." She held his gaze. "I know how that sounds." "How does it sound to you?" "Excessive," she said immediately. "Possibly alarming." Definitely not the kind of thing you lead with when you meet someone. She pressed her lips together. I didn't plan to tell you. I thought I'd move here, and it would either become something natural, or it wouldn't, and if it didn't, I would have a house on a lake and a fresh start, and that would be fine. I wasn't planning to pursue you exactly. It wasn't that calculated. But the toolbox, he said. Her jaw tightened slightly. Just slightly. What about it? Tom left it on my porch. You said you grabbed it by mistake, thinking it was yours. Yes. Tom's not the type to leave something on the wrong porch, Ethan said. His voice was level. He was not angry. He was working the problem the way he worked every problem methodically, without letting emotion get ahead of information. He's deliberate, pays attention. Claire was quiet. The door, Ethan said. The zipper. Ethan. I need to know if that was real. The question landed in the room and stayed there. Claire looked at him, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked something close to uncertain. Not scared. Not ashamed. Just stripped of the composure she usually carried like a second skin. The zipper was real, she said quietly. I genuinely could not get it. I was going to change my dress and skip the whole thing. She paused. The door was not an accident. I heard you on the porch. I didn't close it all the way on purpose. Why? Because I'd been living next door to you for 2 weeks, and you hadn't once come to introduce yourself, and I didn't know how to bridge that without it being obvious, and I thought if there was a moment, something unplanned, something that required us to actually interact. She stopped. I know exactly how it sounds. Ethan turned back to the hull. Not away from her, just somewhere to put his eyes while he processed. He picked up the sandpaper, set it down again, turned back. The photographs in the sketchbook, he said. The breath she exhaled was almost inaudible. You saw that. Corner of one. I didn't look. Pass on. She was silent for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, there are photographs from the boat show, where I first saw you, and a few from after I started coming here, before we met. She said it flatly, without defense. I'm aware that's not okay. I've thought about whether it's not okay approximately 900 times. He looked at her. Were you following me? No. The boat show was public. The others I drove up once to see the town. I was thinking about whether to actually buy the house. I wasn't watching you. I took a picture of the lake and you happened to be on the dock. She pressed her palms flat on her knees. That's the truth. I will understand if you don't believe it. The shop was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the trees that had already lost everything they were going to lose this season. Ethan sat down on the creeper, elbows on his knees, looking at the floor. He ran the facts in order, the way he ran hull assessments. What was damaged, what was sound, what could be repaired, and what had to go. Wait. She had found an article. She had been moved by something in it. Not him specifically, not the man, but something about how he worked, how he treated things that were broken. She had kept the article. She had eventually, over 3 years, let that interest pull her toward a decision that most people would call impulsive, and she had apparently called research. She had staged a moment. She had been careful, and she had been patient, and she had built something genuine on top of a foundation that he hadn't known existed. None of it was what he would have called normal, and none of it, and this was the part that was the hardest to look at directly, none of it felt like what he'd been afraid it might feel like. It didn't feel predatory. It didn't feel dangerous. It felt, if he was being completely honest with himself, like the behavior of a person who had seen something worth wanting and had been too afraid of being rejected outright to approach it straight on. He understood that more than he wanted to admit. I need a day, he said. She stood up immediately. Of course. This isn't me ending anything. She stopped, nodded once. Okay. I just need to think. I know. She picked up her jacket from the hook near the door. For what it's worth, she said, not turning around. Every real thing between us has been real. I didn't engineer your son's questions about Granite. I didn't fake finding the boats interesting. I didn't. She stopped herself, steadied. I came here with a plan to create a first impression. What happened after that was not a plan. That's all I can tell you. She left. Ethan sat in the shop until the light outside went from gray to dark. He did not call Tom. He did not call anyone. He sat with it the way he sat with every hard problem, quietly, patiently waiting for the shape of it to become clear. What became clear was this. He was not angry. He'd examined the space where anger should have been and found something more complicated in its place. Something that felt uncomfortably close to being understood. Because the part that she'd seen in that article, in that photograph, in whatever it was that had reached across 3 years and 2 states and pulled her toward a house on a lake she'd never lived on. It wasn't the man with the reputation or the craftsman with the awards. It was the thing the writer had noted almost in passing in the middle of a technical piece about hull restoration that Ethan Brooks worked on boats that other shops had written off because he believed that most things, if you were willing to put in the real work, could be brought back. That was what she'd seen. And the thing that sat in the center of his chest that night, heavy and specific, was the knowledge that nobody in a very long time, maybe nobody ever including Rachel, had looked at him and seen that particular thing. The next morning, he was at her door before 7. She opened it after the first knock, which meant she'd heard him coming or hadn't slept much either. She was dressed. Coffee was already made. She didn't look surprised to see him, and she didn't look relieved. She just looked at him and waited. "I need to ask one more thing," he said. "Okay." "The day you made your decision to actually buy the house, what made you go from keeping an article to doing something about it?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I was at a dinner at my cousin's house. Tom was talking about the lake. He mentioned you not knowing I knew who you were. He said your wife had left the year before, and you were raising your son alone, and the shop was struggling a little that season, and you'd spent the previous Saturday refinishing an old widow's dock for free because she couldn't afford to hire anyone." She paused. "He said you'd done it without telling her you were coming. You just showed up with your equipment and did it." Ethan was quiet. "I'd been holding on to that article for 2 years by then," she said, "telling myself it was just admiration, that I wasn't actually going to do anything about it, that it was a little pathetic maybe to be that held by a photograph of a stranger." She held his gaze. "And then Tom told that story and I thought that's him. That's the whole person, not just the thing in the photograph, and I made a decision." He stood on her porch in the cold morning and looked at her. She looked back. She didn't push. She didn't fill the silence with anything extra. She was just there the way she was always just there, solid, unhurried, taking up exactly the space she occupied, and no more. "The zipper on the dress," he said. One corner of her mouth moved. "Yes?" "The track was bent. That's a manufacturing defect. You could have returned it." "I know." "It wasn't going to fix itself." "No. So either you bought a dress with a broken zipper on purpose," he said, "or it genuinely got stuck and you genuinely needed help and you saw a way to make something of it." She looked at him steadily. "Which one do you want to believe?" "I want to believe whatever's true." "They're both true," she said. "That's the thing about real life. It's not one or the other. I had a broken dress. I needed help. And yes, I left the door open on purpose because for 2 weeks you'd been fixing everything around me without looking at me, and I needed you to actually look." He was quiet. "Did it work?" she asked. "Claire." "That's not a no." "Mar." He pressed his lips together. He looked at the porch floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'm going to take Noah to the diner for breakfast," he said. "He likes the pancakes there. You want to come?" She blinked. Just once. Then the composure broke just slightly at the edges, and what came through was not triumph or relief, but something much smaller and more honest than either, something that looked a great deal like hope. "Yeah," she said. "Let me get my coat." "Shay." He waited on the porch. Through the door, he could hear her moving the closet opening, and then her voice talking to herself low the way people did when they thought no one was listening. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized the tone. It was the tone of someone who'd been holding something for a very long time and had just tentatively set it down. He understood that too. Noah, for his part, greeted Claire's appearance at breakfast with the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who had already decided the outcome weeks ago and was mildly impatient for the adults to catch up. He moved his jacket from the booth seat next to him, sat her down, and immediately began explaining the diner's pancake ranking system he had apparently developed over multiple visits. Ethan watched his son explaining pancake tiers to a woman who was listening with complete seriousness and felt the thing in his chest shift, not disappear. It wasn't that simple. The wariness didn't evaporate because of one conversation, but shift like a weight redistributing, becoming something he could carry without bracing against it. He ordered coffee. He drank. Outside, the sky was clear and pale and cold in the way of November mornings, when the season has made up its mind, and the town was starting to move, and everything looked the way it always looked. But something in the particular quality of the morning felt different to him. Lighter, less sealed against the outside. As if the insulation he'd been adding year by year to the walls of his ordinary life had developed one small intentional gap. Not a break, not damage. Just enough of an opening to let something in. He didn't name it yet. He wasn't ready for that. But he stopped working quite so hard at keeping it out. And that for Ethan Brooks was enormous. December came in like a door slammed shut.
Noah.
The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days. The lake developed its first skin of ice along the shallows, and Ethan's shop got busy the way it always did. At the end of the season, people suddenly remembering that winterizing a boat was not optional, showing up with guilt and checkbooks, and the particular helplessness of people who had ignored a problem until it became urgent. He worked 6 days that week, sometimes 7. Noah had a school play a book report, a sleepover at a friend's house that required packing and logistics. Biscuit developed a mysterious limp that turned out to be nothing but cost Ethan 2 hours at the vet's office and $40 he hadn't budgeted. Life did what life did. It filled the available space. But Claire filled space too now in ways he'd stopped pretending not to notice. She brought dinner twice that week, not making an event of it, just appearing at the workshop door at 6 o'clock with something warm in a container and leaving before he could offer to pay her back. She picked Noah up from school on Thursday, when Ethan's last boat ran 2 hours over estimate. She sat with Biscuit on her porch in the cold on the afternoon of the vet visit, just because Noah had been worried, and she told him she'd keep the dog company until they got back. Ethan watched all of it. He let it happen. He didn't pull away the way he might have a month ago, and he didn't push forward either. He held the middle ground the way he'd been holding middle ground his whole life. Steady, non-committal, grateful in ways he didn't say out loud. He knew this about himself, had always known it. Rachel had told him more than once in the years before the marriage ended that loving him was like standing outside a house with all its lights on and not being sure you were allowed to knock. He'd heard that. He'd thought about it. He'd meant to do something about it, and then the next day came. And there was always something concrete that needed doing, something real and fixable in front of him. And the abstract work of opening himself up kept getting pushed to after. After had never come. He was thinking about that on a Saturday morning in the middle of December when his phone rang and he saw Rachel's name on the screen for the first time in 4 months. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it ring twice before he picked up. "Hey," she said. Her voice was careful. Professionally careful the way it got when she was approaching something she'd rehearsed. "Hey," he said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I just need to talk to you about the lake house." The lake house. Right. They still owned it together. A small property 2 miles north on the opposite shore, bought in the second year of their marriage. As an investment, never sold because neither of them had pushed for it in the divorce. And both of them had avoided the conversation that would require them to decide. It just sat there, joint owned a loose thread neither of them had tied off. "I've been talking to a realtor," Rachel said. "I think it's time to sell." "Okay," he said. "Send me the paperwork." "I was going to come up," she said. "Sign in person. There are a few things in the house still. Some of mine, maybe some of yours. I figured I'd come up, we'd go through it together, make it clean." He leaned against the counter. "When?" "Next weekend, Saturday. I'd drive up in the morning, we could meet at the house, do what needs doing, and I'd drive back the same day." "Fine," he said. "How's Noah?" "He's good. Pancake phase." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He gets that from you." "I don't have a pancake phase." "Ethan, you ate pancakes 4 mornings a week for our entire marriage." He said nothing. She said nothing. The pause was familiar, not hostile, not warm. Just the acoustic texture of two people who had known each other well and no longer knew what to do with that knowledge. "I'll see you Saturday," she said. "See you Saturday." He set the phone down and stood in the kitchen and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds, which was his version of processing difficult feelings. Then he went back to work. He didn't mention Rachel's visit to Claire. There was no specific reason not to. They weren't together, not officially, not in any way that had been stated or agreed upon, but he didn't mention it, the way you don't mention certain things when you're not sure how they'll land, when you're protecting something that doesn't have a name yet from being complicated by outside forces. Nah. Claire noticed the shift, of course. She noticed everything. On Wednesday, she handed him his coffee and said without preamble, "You're carrying something." "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't fine. I said you're carrying something." He looked at her. She looked back. She wasn't pushing. She never pushed, but she was present in a way that made evasion feel like more work than it was worth. "My ex-wife is coming up Saturday," he said, "to sign papers on a property we still own together." Claire absorbed this with her characteristic stillness. "Do you need anything?" "No." "Okay." She picked up her coffee. "Let me know if that changes." That was it. No interrogation. No visible reaction he had to manage. Just the offer, clean and quiet and without conditions. He watched her walk back through the fence and thought, this is what it would feel like. If he let it. This is exactly what it would feel like. Saturday came gray and cold. Rachel arrived at 11. She drove the same car she'd always driven, practical, well-maintained, exactly what you'd expect. She looked good. She always looked good. She was the kind of woman who held herself together with visible intention, and he'd always respected that about her, even when the marriage had stopped working. They met at the lake house. They went through the rooms. It took about an hour. The property was small, and most of what remained were things that had been forgotten rather than kept. An old lamp, some books, a box of kitchen equipment. They divided it without argument, which was how they handled most things, now that the pressure was off. They were better at this version of each other than they'd been at the married version. The realtor's paperwork took 20 minutes. Afterward, they stood in the driveway, and there was no particular reason to keep standing there, but neither of them moved immediately to their cars. Rachel looked at the lake for a moment. Then she said, "Tom Garrett tells me you have a new neighbor." Ethan looked at her sideways. "Tom needs a hobby that isn't other people's business." "He says she's good with Noah." "She is." "And good for you, he thinks." "Tom thinks a lot of things." Rachel turned to look at him directly. She had a particular look, he'd seen it 1,000 times, that meant she was about to say something real, something underneath the conversation they'd been having, and he'd better brace for contact. "Ethan," she said, "can I say something and have you actually hear it? You're going to say it either way." "You're a good man," she said. "You're one of the best men I've ever known. And I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, believe that being married to you was the right thing for about 6 of the 8 years we were together." She paused. "But you never once told me that you loved me without me saying it first. In 8 years." He was quiet. "Not because you didn't," she said quickly. I know you did. I always knew you did. But you couldn't say it. You'd fix everything in the house, and you'd remember every single thing I'd mentioned once in passing, and you'd show up without being asked every time something needed doing, but you would not say the words. And at some point, she stopped, gathered herself. At some point, a person needs to hear the words, not instead of everything else, in addition to it. He was looking at the lake now. Rachel. I'm not saying this to reopen anything, she said clearly. I'm saying it because I think there might be someone who deserves those words, and I think you might be close to letting another chance go by without saying them. She held his gaze when he looked back at her. Don't do that. He didn't answer. She didn't wait for one. She picked up the box she was taking, put it in her car, and then paused with her hand on the door. She moved here for you, you know, she said. Tom told me the whole story. He thought I should know. A brief, unreadable expression crossed her face. It doesn't bother me the way it might have once. Mostly what I felt was she saw something I sometimes missed. The part of you worth traveling for. She got in the car. She drove away. Ethan stood in the driveway until he couldn't hear the engine anymore. He drove home. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a moment. Next door, the lights were on in Claire's house. He could see her through the window doing something in the kitchen, the ordinary motion of a person in their own space on a Saturday afternoon. She didn't know he was sitting there. She wasn't performing anything. She was just living 12 feet of yard and a split-rail fence between them, completely unaware of what the last 4 hours had produced. He got out of the truck. He did not go to her door. Not because he was pulling back, but because what Rachel had handed him was heavy in a way that required more than an afternoon to unpack, and he was a man who did not act on things before he understood them clearly. He'd made that mistake before moving, before he was ready committing to shapes without checking the structure underneath. He fed Biscuit. He started dinner. Noah was home from his friend's house by 4, loud and happy, and full of information about a video game he'd played that he wanted to describe in technical detail for approximately 40 minutes. Ethan sat at the kitchen table and listened to his son, and thought about 8 years of I love you always going in one direction. He hadn't known it was only going one direction. He would have said, if anyone had asked that, of course he loved Rachel, that she knew he loved her, that it went without saying. He would have said that what he did, the fixing, the showing up, the remembering, was love. And it was. He wasn't wrong about that. He'd just been wrong about it being enough. He sat with that all the way through dinner, through Noah's bath time, through reading 2 chapters of a book about a dog who solved mysteries which Noah had selected and was taking very seriously. He sat with it after Noah fell asleep on the porch in the cold with no coffee because he'd forgotten to make any. At 7:15, he heard Claire's back door open and close. A minute later, the porch light next door went on. Then her voice quiet. Ethan. Yeah, you didn't get your coffee this morning. I was going to leave it, but I wasn't sure when you'd be back. He almost said, I'm fine. Thank you, good night. The words were already in his mouth. The default response, the one that kept everything sealed and manageable and exactly as complicated as it currently was, and no more complicated. Instead, he said, You want to come sit for a minute? A pause. Then, Yeah, let me get my coat. She came through the gate with 2 mugs, handed him one without asking whether he wanted it, sat down in the second porch chair, pulled her coat tighter, looked at the dark lake. They sat. After a while, she said, How was it? Easier than I expected, he said, and harder. She didn't ask him to explain the contradiction because she seemed to understand it wasn't a contradiction. He drank his coffee. The cold was the specific kind of still that came before snow, the whole world gone quiet and dense and waiting. Rachel said something, he said. Claire waited. She said I never told her I loved her first, in 8 years. He held the mug in both hands. I've been sitting with that all day." Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and honest, which was the only register she seemed to have. "Do you think she was right?" "Yeah," he said. "I think she was right." "Why?" He thought about it the way he thought about all structural problems, not quickly, not impulsively. "Because saying it means you can't take it back," he said finally. "And I don't handle breaking things well." She turned to look at him. He kept looking at the lake. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "Probably. For what it's worth," she said slowly. "I think you handle broken things better than almost anyone. I've watched you work. You don't break things. You're terrified of starting the break. But once something's already broken, you don't give up on it. You stay." She paused. "That's rare, Ethan. That's actually rare." He looked at her then. The porch light was behind her, and her face was in partial shadow, and she was looking at him with that straightforward, patient attention that he had come to understand over these past weeks was simply who she was. Not a performance, not a tactic, just a woman who looked at what was in front of her without flinching. "Yeah." He thought about the article, the photograph, the house, the bent zipper and the open door, and the coffee that appeared every morning like a quiet, persistent argument that the world could be reliably good. He thought about what it meant that she had done all of that. Not with manipulation, not with pressure, but with patience. The same patience he used on hulls that other people had written off. She'd been treating him, he realized, the way he treated boats. Like something worth the real work. "I know I'm not easy," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're not. I don't talk about things well." "You're doing it right now," she said. "You've been doing it for 10 minutes. That's more than you think it is." He looked back at the lake. She looked back at the lake. The cold pressed in from all sides, and neither of them moved. "I need more time," he said. "I know," she said. "I've got time." "You've been patient a long time already." 3 years, she agreed without apology. "A little longer won't break me." He looked at her sharply. She caught his expression, and her mouth curved slightly, not a full smile, just the suggestion of one. "Too soon to joke about it?" she asked. Despite everything, something in his chest loosened. Maybe just slightly too soon. "Noted. I'll wait 6 more weeks before making that joke again." He stood up. She stood up. She took his empty mug, stacked it with hers, the small automatic gesture of someone who'd been paying attention to what he needed long before he started noticing she was doing it. At the gate, she stopped, turned back. "For what it's worth," she said, and her voice was different now, quieter, stripped of the lightness she used to manage difficult moments. "I moved here for what I thought you might be. Everything since then, the coffee, your son, the boats, you sitting on this porch in the freezing cold, has been for who you actually are." She held his gaze. "Those are 2 different things. The second one is the one that matters." She went through the gate. He heard her porch door close. He stood in the cold for another few minutes, looking at the place where she'd been standing. He went inside. He did not sleep well again, but it was a different kind of sleeplessness than the one he'd carried before. Less like lying awake in an empty room, and more like sitting near a fire when the wood has just caught warm in ways he wasn't used to, yet aware of heat in places that had been cold for a long time. He woke up at 5:30. He lay in the dark and listened to Biscuit snoring from the hallway. He thought about Rachel in the driveway. He thought about Claire on the porch. He thought about what it cost specifically to say the words first. He mapped it out the way he mapped out a repair. What was at risk? What was the worst failure mode? Whether the structure could hold the load. He realized somewhere around 6 in the morning that he'd been running the wrong assessment. He'd been calculating the risk of saying it and having it go wrong. He hadn't been calculating the cost of never saying it. He'd made that calculation once before over 8 years, and the bill had come due, and it had been higher than he'd budgeted for. He got up. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the pale blue house and watched the light come on in Claire's kitchen at 6:47, right on schedule the way it did every morning. He watched her move past the window. He picked up his mug. He put it down. He got his coat. He was on her porch at 6:52, his breath visible in the cold morning air, his hand raised to knock the words, not yet formed but present, not rehearsed, not perfect but real, the way real things never were perfect, when the door opened before he could make contact. She looked at him. She was holding her own coffee. She was still in the oversized flannel she slept in, hair loose, not ready for the day, yet caught genuinely off guard for the first time since he'd known her. And it was the most honest he'd ever seen her look. "You're early," she said. "I know," he said. He opened his mouth. And then Noah's voice came from inside, loud, cheerful, completely unconcerned with dramatic timing. "Claire Biscuit got into your recycling bin again, and I think he ate part of a cardboard box, and I don't know if that's bad." Claire's eyes went wide. She turned. Ethan exhaled, closed his eyes, put his hand briefly over his face. "Jage." From inside. "He seems fine, but he looks guilty, which I think is suspicious." Claire turned back to Ethan. She was trying not to laugh. She was losing. "How did Noah even—" Ethan started. "He has a key," she said. "I gave him one. For emergencies." "This is what he considers an emergency." "In his defense," she said, losing the battle with the laugh, "Biscuit does look guilty." Ethan looked at her. She looked at him. The moment that had been right there, immediate, ready, the exact shape of what he'd walked across the yard to do, had dissolved completely into the ordinary chaos of a Tuesday morning, and a dog and a 7-year-old who had terrible timing and the complete confidence of someone who knew he was loved. "Tonight," Ethan said. "I need to say something tonight." Her laughter faded. Not into worry, into attention. Her eyes steady on his. "Okay," she said. "After Noah's in bed." "Okay," she said again. He nodded. He went inside to deal with his dog. And for the rest of that day, whatever he was carrying didn't feel like weight anymore. It felt like direction. He spent the whole day thinking about what he was going to say. That was the problem. Ethan Brooks was a man who prepared. He measured twice. He checked the grain before he cut. He pressure tested before he put anything back in the water. So all day between customers and invoices, and Noah coming into the workshop after school to sit on the spare stool and eat an apple and narrate his day in the particular stream of consciousness style of a 7-year-old who had no concept of editing, Ethan was quietly, persistently rehearsing. By 4 o'clock he had 3 different versions. By 5:30 he had none that he trusted. Yet he made dinner. Pasta because it was fast, and Noah ate it without negotiation. He listened to Noah talk about a disagreement on the playground that had been resolved through what sounded like very sophisticated diplomacy for a 2nd grader. He washed the dishes. He supervised homework. He read the dog mystery book for 30 minutes. He sat in the dark hallway outside Noah's room until the breathing on the other side of the door went slow and even. 7:58. He went downstairs. He put on his coat. He stood in the kitchen for approximately 45 seconds looking at nothing. Then he walked next door. He knocked once. She opened the door, and she was not in her flannel. This time she had changed jeans, a dark sweater hair down, the quiet preparation of someone who had known all day that the night mattered and had decided to meet it properly. She held the door open without a word, and he came inside. She had made coffee. 2 mugs on the kitchen table. No pretense of it being anything other than what it was. 2 people who needed to sit and say things that had been waiting too long. He sat. She sat. Neither of them picked up their mugs. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I had a whole speech," he said. "How long did you work on it?" All day. How much of it are you going to use? None of it, he said. It wasn't right. She folded her hands on the table, patient, present, entirely herself. Okay, she said. Then don't use it. He exhaled. Rachel was right, he said. About the words, about what I don't say. He paused. I knew she was right when she said it, and I've known it before that, honestly. I've known it's a problem the way you know a boat has a slow leak. You keep bailing, you keep it running. You tell yourself you'll deal with it properly when things slow down and things don't slow down, and one day the water's over the floorboards. Claire didn't move. I let her leave, he said. Not because I stopped loving her, because I couldn't make myself say it enough, and she stopped believing it was there. And I understood that. I never blamed her for leaving. I blamed the part of me that locked things up and thought that was the same as keeping them safe. He looked up. It's not the same. I know that. I know you know that, she said quietly. The thing is, he said, with you it's different, and I've been trying to figure out for weeks whether it's different because you're you or because I've changed or because I'm just scared in a different direction now. He stopped. I think it's all three. What are you scared of now? She asked. Not challenging. Genuinely asking the way she asked about everything. Not saying it, he said. I'm scared of not saying it and watching the same thing happen again. Watching you decide at some point that what I do isn't proof enough, because it's never proof enough on its own, is it? It's not, it shouldn't be the whole sentence. He pressed his palms flat on the table, the way she did when she was steadying herself. He'd picked that up from her without noticing. I love you, Claire. The room went very quiet. She looked at him. Her expression didn't do what he'd half expected, didn't break open, didn't overflow. She just held very still, the way she held still when something mattered, and her eyes were bright in the kitchen light, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Say it again." He didn't hesitate. I love you. She breathed out, slow, deliberate, like a structure settling after a long time under pressure. And then she reached across the table and put her hand over his. I've loved you, she said, since I read an article in a boating magazine about a man in upstate New York who spent 6 months restoring a hull that 3 other shops told the owner to scrap. She paused. I know how that sounds. It sounds like you, he said. She looked at him sharply. He held her gaze. It sounds exactly like you, he said. Which is, I've thought about it a lot. What you did. Most people would find it alarming. I did a little at first, but what I kept coming back to was what you actually saw. You didn't see me on a dating profile. You didn't see me at a bar. You saw how I worked. You saw what I did when something was broken and other people had given up on it. He turned his hand over so he was holding hers instead of the other way around. I don't know what that says about you. Maybe it says something a little intense. It definitely says something a little intense, she said. But it also says that you saw me, not the surface, the actual thing. He stopped, steadied. Nobody's done that before. Not like that. Her jaw tightened for just a moment, the specific tightness of someone who is not going to cry in front of another person, but is conducting an active negotiation with themselves about it. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Okay, I love you too. I just said that. Try to keep up. He laughed. It came out surprised the way his laughs usually did, like they caught him off guard by existing. She laughed too, and the tension that had been sitting in the room since he walked in, the formal, important weight of everything tension, shifted into something warmer and less ceremonial, something that felt like regular life, rather than a turning point, even though it was both. He picked up his coffee. She picked up hers. He drank. She drank. Outside, the wind was doing something to the trees, and Biscuit was audible from the other house, a low, grumbling snore that carried through the cold air even across the yard, and the kitchen was warm. After a while, she said, "What happens now?" "I have no idea," he said. "I've never done this in the right order before." "Neither have I," she said. "And my version of the beginning was somewhat unorthodox." "Somewhat. I regret the photographs," she said. "I want you to know that. Not the article, not moving here, but taking those I should not have done that." "No," he agreed. "I was afraid if I just showed up and introduced myself like a normal person, you'd say hello, and that would be it." "I would have," he said. "Probably." "I know. That's why I was afraid." She set her mug down. "I'm not going to pretend the way I started this was okay, but I am not sorry for starting it." He looked at her steadily. "Neither am I," he said. And he meant it without reservation, which surprised him because he was usually a man who built reservations into everything. That night, he walked home at 10:30 through the cold yard past the maple through the back door. He stood in his kitchen for a moment. The house was quiet in the way it always was, but the quality of the quiet had changed. It wasn't empty. It was just still. He went to bed. He slept for 8 hours straight, which hadn't happened in months. The days that followed moved differently. Not dramatically, he was still Ethan. Still measured, still a man who expressed things in actions before words. But the words came now. Imperfect, infrequent, never speeches, but real. He said them when he felt them, which was the only way he knew to say them correctly. Noah, who had been conducting an internal referendum on this situation for weeks, delivered his verdict on a Tuesday morning when Claire came through the back gate with coffee, and Noah said, completely without preamble, "Are you guys going to get married?" Ethan choked on his coffee. Claire said without missing a beat, "We're figuring that out." "Because I want a dog vote if we get another dog," Noah said. "Biscuit is Dad's dog. I should get one." "That seems like a separate conversation," Claire said. "I'm just being proactive," he said. Ethan looked at Claire over his son's head. She looked back. The laughter was already in her eyes before it reached her face. "Proactive," Ethan repeated. "Mrs. Larson says that's good," Noah said. "Mrs. Larson is right," Claire said. "Dang." Life rearranged itself around the new shape of things, gradually the way water finds its level. Claire's key to the workshop appeared on his keyring. He didn't ask how she didn't explain, it was simply there one morning. He started leaving a mug at her house, specifically for him on the hook next to the door. Noah stopped asking permission before going through the fence. Biscuit fully relocated his napping operations to Claire's porch and ceased pretending otherwise. And Tom Garrett, for his part, said nothing beyond a single brief sentence delivered while helping Ethan replank the dock in February, which was, "Told you." Ethan handed him a drill, and they didn't discuss it further. Spring came late, as it usually did. The ice went out of the lake in early April in a single loud cracking overnight that Noah declared the best sound in the world and immediately tried to record on his tablet. The shop got busy. Claire got a commission for a hotel in Vermont, large enough to occupy most of her studio for 3 months, and she worked long hours with the same focused intensity she brought to everything, and Ethan learned to recognize when she needed coffee versus when she needed silence, versus when she needed to talk through a design problem with someone who wouldn't pretend to know more about furniture than he did. He was useful to her. That mattered to him more than he expected it to. She was useful to him in different ways, not fixing or managing or organizing, but seeing. She watched him work, and she understood what she was watching, and she asked questions that occasionally made him look at his own methods from an angle he hadn't tried. She noticed when he was tired before he did. She remembered the things he mentioned once and never mentioned again. The same way he did, the same quality of attention turned in his direction, and it was disorienting and good in equal measure. Yes, in June, they stood together at a town planning meeting and proposed a community boathouse project, a shared dock and storage facility for the east side of the lake, where several older residents had lost practical water access as their own docks had deteriorated and they hadn't had the resources to repair them. Claire had drawn the plans. Ethan had estimated the materials and the structural requirements. They'd been working on it quietly for 2 months before bringing it to the town. The meeting ran 3 hours. There were objections, questions, a 40-minute detour about parking that had nothing to do with the project. Ethan spoke twice, both times briefly and specifically. Claire spoke once for 7 minutes and covered everything she needed to cover with the precision of someone who had thought through every counterargument before walking in. The vote passed 14-3. Walking out of the town hall afterward, Tom slapped Ethan on the shoulder hard enough to require forward momentum to absorb. "That," Tom said, "is a genuinely good thing you two are doing." "It was her design," Ethan said. "It was both of yours," Claire said, and linked her arm through his, which she did sometimes in public. Now not performance, just contact, the easy physical language of people who had stopped keeping track of where one person ended and the other began. The boathouse took the whole summer to build. Ethan ran the structural work. Claire coordinated materials and managed the volunteer schedule, which turned out to be a much harder job than it sounded, because volunteers had opinions and schedules, and a communal worksite generated more interpersonal complexity per square foot than anywhere Ethan had ever been. She handled it with the combination of patience and absolute clarity that was her particular genius, and he watched her do it every weekend and thought, with the regularity and conviction of something that had simply become true, there she is. That's who she is. The day of the dedication ceremony was a Saturday in late September, exactly 1 year after Claire had moved to Lake Carver. It was the kind of fall day that upstate New York occasionally produced, as if to remind everyone why they stayed through the winters, clear, cold, bright, the trees doing their full accounting of color. Half the town came. Linda Henderson came, the woman whose dock Ethan had refinished 3 years ago. And she shook Claire's hand for a long time and told her the project had given her lake back to her, and Claire thanked her and didn't make it into a thing which was exactly right. Noah was there, officially responsible for Biscuit, a job he took with the gravity of a Secret Service detail. Biscuit was cooperative for approximately the first 40 minutes, and then attempted to eat someone's potato salad. Yeah, there were speeches. Ethan gave the shortest one. He said the project had been Claire's vision, that it had required about 40 people to build it, and that if you wanted something in this town done well, the best approach was still just to show up and do the work. People laughed. Claire, standing to his left, shook her head slowly. Afterward, when most of the crowd had moved toward the food, Claire was talking to Linda Henderson near the edge of the dock, and Ethan stood slightly apart, watching her, the way she turned toward Linda, fully, the way she gave the older woman her complete attention, the way she'd been doing it all day, with everyone who approached them, never deflecting, never managing her energy in the way of someone counting down until they could leave. Miesche. He knew her now. He knew she would be tired tonight, genuinely tired, because this kind of sustained engagement cost her something real, even when she made it look effortless. He knew she'd want quiet eventually. He knew what her tired looked like, and what her worried looked like, and what her thinking through a problem looked like, and he knew the difference between her real laugh and her polite laugh, and he knew that she put extra sugar in her coffee when she was frustrated and didn't notice she was doing it. He knew her. He walked toward her. Linda Henderson saw him coming and graciously manufactured a reason to speak to Tom, who was nearby and had learned in the last year to be gracious about these things. Claire turned as he reached her. She looked up at him. "Good day," she said. "Yeah," he said. She was wearing the green dress. Not the same dress she'd told him she'd replaced the zipper on the original, finally taken it to a seamstress, the way he'd recommended the first day. But this one was similar. Dark green, same neckline, same silhouette. She'd put it on that morning, and he'd known immediately it wasn't accidental. He reached out. She turned slightly. Old habit. He almost smiled. "Zipper check," he said. "Just seeing if you're paying attention. I'm always paying attention." "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." He put his hand on her back, not the zipper, just his hand steady and certain between her shoulder blades. She leaned into it, the small real weight of a person who trusted the thing holding them. 1 year, he said. 1 year, she agreed. You bought a house you'd never seen in a town you'd never lived in because of a boating magazine. When you say it like that, I'm not criticizing, he said. I'm saying that you did that and it led to this, whatever this is. He paused. Which I think is a lot. She looked at him. The water was behind her and the light was doing something particular to the afternoon, and she looked the way she always looked, direct, unhurried, like someone who had decided a long time ago that life was worth showing up for completely. What do you think this is? She asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he did everything. Home, he said. She went still in the way she did when something real landed, but he kept his hand where it was. I know I'm not easy, he said. I know I'm going to keep fixing things instead of talking about them sometimes. I know I'll make coffee wrong, and I know I still forget half days on the school calendar, and I know there are things I'm going to have to learn how to say out loud that I've been carrying around in my chest for 44 years. He looked at her steadily. But I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to let the words wait anymore. Her jaw did the thing, the specific tightness of someone in active negotiation with themselves. She pressed her lips together. You're going to make me cry at a public event, she said. You don't have to cry. I know I don't have to, she said. That's not the problem. Noah's voice carried from somewhere behind them. Dad Biscuit got in the potato salad. I tried to stop him, but he was very fast. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Claire started laughing. The real laugh surprised out of her, the one that changed her whole face and had been the sound from the beginning that made something in his chest open without him choosing it. He turned toward his son. Noah, I told you to hold the leash. I was holding it. He's strong. Claire's hand found his arm briefly as he moved past her. A touch, a press. The small physical language they'd developed without deciding to. He went to deal with his dog. She followed, still laughing. And there it was, not the dramatic conclusion he might have written if he were the kind of man who wrote conclusions. Not the movie ending where everything paused and swelled and wrapped itself clean. Just a doc and a dog, and his son holding a now empty serving spoon with an expression of genuine helplessness. And Claire moving to crouch next to Biscuit and check that he hadn't eaten anything that would require a vet visit, and Tom in the background making a face that clearly said he was glad it wasn't his problem, and the lake and the light, and the full, ordinary, beautiful weight of a life that had somehow, without his planning, it been repaired. Not restored to some earlier version, not returned to what it had been before the loss and the quiet and the years of being careful. Built into something new. From the good pieces of the old and the better pieces of what had come after. The way the best restorations always worked, not erasure, not pretense, but honest work that honored what had survived and knew what to keep. That night, after Noah was asleep and Biscuit was banned from the yard pending further review, Ethan and Claire sat on the porch in the cold, and he held her hand and didn't say much because he didn't need to, because the words were there now when he needed them, and the silence was safe when he didn't. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. He didn't move. He breathed. He thought about an article in a small magazine, a photograph on a dock, a woman who had seen something worth traveling toward and had traveled toward it with more patience and precision than he'd ever applied to anything, including the boats. He thought about a zipper and an open door, and 5 words that had cracked his careful, quiet, well-maintained world right down the middle. And he thought with the clear, unguarded certainty of a man who had finally stopped confusing caution with safety that the crack was exactly where the light had gotten in. Some things, when you finally stop protecting them from change, don't break. They open. And what comes through is better than what you were guarding. That was the truth Ethan Brooks had spent his whole life fixing boats to learn. And he was at 44 years old on a porch in upstate New York, holding the hand of a woman who had known it before. He did finally, completely without reservation, ready to live it,